Alien princes terrified. We only battled a human scout unit. The first shot came before I even had my boots fully on the ground. That is how fast it happened. One moment I was dropping through the atmosphere of Velkari-held space with my squad spread out around me in a tight insertion cone, and the next moment the air below us lit up with plasma bolts the color of a dying star. Private Len Cole shouted something into the comm, but the noise swallowed it whole. I pulled my descent pack cord 2 seconds early, hit the ground at an angle that sent me rolling through something that smelled like burnt copper, and came up already moving. 12 of us had gone in. The insertion plan called for a quiet landing on the north ridge of the Velkari supply corridor, deep reconnaissance, no engagement, and extraction in 72 hours. Simple math. Clean mission. Command had been very specific about that last part. Do not engage. We were scouts, not a strike force. Our job was to count supply ships, map patrol patterns, and come home. That was the plan. Corporal Nina Yena landed 3 meters to my left and immediately sneezed. I am not joking. I wish I were. It was the kind of sneeze that a person cannot stop, the kind that builds in the back of the throat and detonates before any amount of willpower can prevent it. It was loud. In the silence of that ridge, with 300 Velkari soldiers moving through the valley below us, it rang out like a starting pistol. There was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you the world is about to change direction. Then every light in that valley turned toward us. I had been a scout for 6 years at that point. I had been in tight situations before. I had been extracted from enemy lines twice, had once spent 11 days hiding in the hollow of a frozen mountain on a planet that had no official name, just a number in a catalog. But nothing quite prepares you for the moment when 300 soldiers and 6 armored war platforms all rotate in your direction at the same time. The sound of that much weaponry coming to bear is not a sound you forget. "Contact," I said into the comm. My voice was flat. There was nothing else to say. Everyone in the squad could already see it. Sergeant Danny R. Ash was first to respond, as she always was. She was already repositioning before I finished the word, moving to a low rocky outcrop to my right, with her long-range suppression rifle in both hands. Private Cole was a half-step behind her. The others were spreading instinctively into a loose defensive arc, using the ridge terrain the way we had been trained since our first year. Every rock is cover, every slope is a tool, every shadow is a friend. I pulled up the tactical display on my wrist unit. The numbers were not encouraging. 312 Velkari ground forces. 6 war platforms, each one roughly equivalent to a small armored vehicle, each one carrying enough firepower to level a city block. 12 humans on a ridge, with scout-grade weapons, and enough field rations for 3 days. The Velkari did not attack immediately. That was interesting. I noted it even then, in that first crackling moment of contact. They had us surrounded on 3 sides, the 4th being a steep drop into a ravine we could not safely descend in the dark. They had us completely, cleanly boxed in, and they paused. A voice came through the open comm channel, translated in real time by the small interpreter unit clipped to my collar. The voice was smooth and very confident. It carried the particular kind of confidence that belongs to someone who has never been surprised by an outcome in their life. 12 humans, the voice said. You have entered the sovereign territory of the Velkari primacy under arms. Surrender your weapons and your persons. We shall be merciful. I recognized the cadence of that voice. I had heard recordings during our pre-mission briefing. It belonged to Prince Velarath, the 3rd son of the Velkari High Sovereign, a military commander of considerable reputation. He led from the front, which was either impressive or foolish, depending on your perspective. He was currently aboard his mobile command platform at the rear of the formation. He had 300 soldiers and 6 war platforms, and he was offering mercy to 12 people. I looked at the squad. They were all looking at me. Not with panic. Scouts do not panic. We are specifically selected and specifically trained to not panic, which is harder than it sounds and takes longer to learn than anything else in the program. They were looking at me with focus, with the particular sharpening of attention that comes when the stakes climb past a certain point and the human brain decides that thinking faster is the only acceptable option. Private OCA Grant was crouched behind a flat stone to my left. He was the youngest member of the squad, 23 years old, on only his second deployment. He had a scar above his left eyebrow from a training accident, and a habit of speaking quietly even when the situation called for noise. He caught my eye, and gave the smallest shrug I have ever seen a person give. "Sir," he said, just above a whisper, "I have done worse math." I almost smiled. I almost let myself do it. Instead, I clicked the squad channel closed to outside frequencies and started talking. Quietly, quickly, with exactly the kind of clarity that the situation required. Here is what most people do not understand about human scout training. The weapons are almost secondary. The firepower we carry is real and effective, but the firepower is not the point. The point is the mind. A scout is trained, above all other things, to think with the environment, to read terrain the way a musician reads a page of notes, to understand instinctively what the ground around them can do, what it can hide, what it can absorb, what it can redirect. The ridge we were on was basalt-heavy, which meant it did not echo the way softer stone would. The valley below was wide enough that the Valkyrie formation had natural gaps at the lateral edges of their encirclement. The war platforms were powerful but slow to reorient, designed for open field engagement rather than closed-terrain pursuit. The night was dark, genuinely dark, because this planet had no moon and the cloud cover was thick and low. I had been on the ground for less than 4 minutes, and I already knew 7 things about the terrain that the Valkyrie, despite living on this world, did not appear to have considered. I gave the squad their assignments in 11 words. Scouts do not need more than that. Each of them nodded once and moved. Prince Velarath's voice came through the open channel again, slightly less patient this time. "You have 30 seconds to respond." I activated my translator and keyed the open channel. "We need a moment," I said. There was a pause on their end. Apparently they had not expected that answer. "A moment," the prince repeated. "Yes," I said. "We are discussing your offer." Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear muffled Valkyrie voices in the background of the transmission, too fast and too layered for the translator to catch cleanly. Whatever they were saying, they clearly had not planned for this particular response. I used the 30 extra seconds they inadvertently gave us. By the time the prince spoke again, Nina Yena was already at the eastern edge of the ridge, with a directional disruptor planted against the base of a natural rock column. Donniar had her rifle trained on the lead war platform's optical array, from an angle the platform's own defensive sensors had a known blind spot on. Cole and Grant were in position at the 2 gap points I had identified in the Valkyrie lateral line. The rest of the squad was distributed across the ridge in a pattern that looked like a defensive crouch but was, in fact, the opening configuration of something considerably more aggressive. 12 humans, Prince Velarath said, and this time there was an edge in the smooth voice. The first crack in all that confidence. "This is your final moment. Surrender, or we will be forced to act." I looked out at the valley, at 312 soldiers, at 6 war platforms, at the walls of firepower pointed at a ridge where 12 people stood in the dark. I thought about the 72 hours we still had before extraction. I thought about Osei Grant's quiet shrug and his quiet voice saying the math did not look that bad. I clicked the squad channel open. "All positions confirmed?" 11 voices came back, 11 confirmations. I keyed the open channel one more time. "I'm sorry, Prince," I said, "but we are going to have to decline." The valley exploded into light. And so did we. They expected us to run. I could tell that immediately, in the first seconds of the engagement, from the way their formation moved. A standard Valkyrie encirclement tactic assumes that a cornered unit will attempt to break through the weakest point of the encircling line and flee in a straight path. The entire formation is designed to collapse around that predicted escape vector, like a fist closing. We did not run. We went sideways. Not all of us at once. That would have been obvious. We peeled apart in 3 directions at the same moment, each group of 4 moving along a different axis of the ridge, using the terrain not as cover to hide behind, but as a moving system to navigate through. Scout doctrine calls it fluid dispersion. The idea is simple. If you are one target, you are easy to engage. If you are 12 targets moving in 3 directions through broken terrain at night, you become a problem that requires 12 separate decisions, and decision-making takes time, and time is the one resource we intended to take away from them entirely. Nina Yena triggered the disruptor at the rock column 30 seconds into the engagement. The column came down in a controlled fall, not explosive but heavy, and it took a section of the ridge edge with it. The sound was enormous. The dust cloud it produced was even more enormous. From the Valkyrie position below, the dust must have looked like half the ridge had collapsed. 3 of the 6 war platforms halted immediately, recalibrating. Their optical sensors, we knew from intelligence briefings, were sensitive enough to be partially blinded by heavy particulate clouds. Daniar fired through the dust. She did not fire at soldiers. She fired at the optical array of the lead war platform with 2 precise shots, hitting the sensor cluster at the exact angle where the armor plating had its thinnest tolerance. The platform did not explode. It simply stopped seeing properly. It began tracking in the wrong direction. Its targeting system confused between the dust, the sound of the collapsed column, and the scrambled input from its damaged sensors. That was the first war platform removed from the equation. Not destroyed. Made useless, which is faster and quieter and achieves the same result. Cole and Grant moved through the gap in the lateral line I had identified, not to escape, to get behind. This is the part I had to explain very carefully to the tribunal, because it is the part that most people, including military people, find difficult to believe. We went behind their encirclement. On purpose. 12 scout-grade soldiers moved through a gap in a formation of 300 and set up positions inside the Valkyrie perimeter, behind their own rear line. The Valkyrie were looking up at the ridge. Their backs were to us. Private Cole has a quality I have only seen in a handful of soldiers across my entire career. He is perfectly calm when he should not be. Not the manufactured calm of someone pushing emotion down by force of discipline, but a genuine, organic, settled calm that seems to arise from some deep part of his nature that simply does not register danger the same way most people do. Some people find it unsettling. I find it extremely useful in enclosed spaces behind enemy lines. He and Grant worked through the rear of the Valkyrie formation for 40 minutes. They did not engage directly. They disrupted. They cut power relay lines to 2 of the remaining war platforms using tools that every scout carries for exactly this kind of work. They planted signal scramblers at 3 points along the Valkyrie communication backbone, devices small enough to hold in one hand but effective enough to make coordinated command communication difficult within a localized radius. They repositioned twice when Valkyrie soldiers came too close, moving with the kind of patient, unhurried precision that looks from the outside like they had all the time in the world. On the ridge, the rest of us made sure the Valkyrie were not thinking about their rear line. I have to be honest with the tribunal about something. We were not entirely in control during those first 40 minutes. There were moments of genuine danger that did not come from tactical calculation, but from the kind of raw chaos that exists in any engagement, regardless of how well you have planned it. Private Osei Grant took a glancing hit from a plasma bolt in the first 10 minutes, a graze along his left arm that left a burn mark the length of my hand. He reset his grip on his weapon, said nothing, and kept moving. Private Lena Ford stumbled on loose rock in the dark and went down hard. She was back on her feet in under 2 seconds. Corporal Yena, who had started this entire situation with a sneeze, moved through that engagement with a focus and precision that I have never seen her match before or since, as though the embarrassment of the sneeze had converted itself entirely into concentrated professionalism. Daniar was the one I watched most carefully. She had taken a hit in the first exchange, a real hit, not a graze. It caught her in the outer muscle of her right thigh. In any other situation, that would have been the end of her active participation. She applied a field tourniquet to herself while continuing to move, which is something that sounds simple when described in a report, and is not simple at all in practice. The Valkyrie soldiers who caught a glimpse of her during those minutes, still moving, still shooting accurately, apparently did not know what to do with that information. Their training assumed that a wounded enemy was a diminished threat. She was not a diminished threat. She was a concentrated one. By the time the dust began to settle after the first hour, 3 of the 6 war platforms were out of action. The Valkyrie formation had fractured into at least 4 separate response clusters that were no longer communicating cleanly with each other because of the scramblers Cole and Grant had placed. Prince Velarath had repositioned his command platform twice, which told me he was uncertain where the threat was actually coming from. That was important. Uncertainty is the most expensive thing you can give an enemy. It costs them time, coordination, confidence, and decision-making speed, all at once, for free. I pulled the squad back to a consolidation point on the northern end of the ridge at the 90-minute mark. Head count, 12 in, 12 present, 2 with injuries, both mobile. I did the math on what we had accomplished against what it had cost us, and the numbers, for the first time since the engagement began, started to look manageable. Then I heard Prince Velarath's voice come through the open channel again. The smooth confidence from his first transmission was gone. In its place was something I had not expected to hear from a Valkyrie royal commander with 300 soldiers at his disposal. Something careful. Something with the particular texture of a person who is beginning to revise their understanding of a situation from the ground up. "Identify your unit," he said. "What division? What designation?" I considered not answering. Then I decided that the answer itself was worth more than the silence. "Scout unit," I said. Standard compliment. There was a pause so long I thought the connection had dropped. "Say again?" Prince Velarath said. "Scout unit," I repeated. 12 personnel, standard deployment. Reconnaissance configuration. Another pause. This one different from the first. The first pause had been strategic. This one was something else entirely. I had heard enough of those pauses from enough different people in enough different situations to recognize what it was. It was shock. "Request reinforcements," I heard him say, in Valkyrie. Not to me, but to someone in his command chain. The translator caught it quietly. "Full battalion. Armored support. Priority extraction for command personnel." I lowered the comm unit and looked across the consolidation point at my squad. 11 faces looking back at me in the dark, dust-covered, 2 of them wearing field dressings, all of them alert and waiting. "He is calling in a full battalion," I said. 1,200 soldiers. Armored support. Private OCI Grant, who was sitting with his back against a rock and his burned arm resting across his knee, tilted his head slightly. "For us," he said. "For us," I confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the same unhurried calm as before, he said, "How long until they arrive?" 6 hours, I said. "Approximately." He nodded slowly. He looked at the ground. Then he looked back up at me with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was definitely something in the direction of one. "Sir," he said, "we have 6 hours and nothing to do." Corporal Yenna made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Daniar was already pulling up the terrain map on her wrist unit. Cole was checking his equipment inventory, with the focused attention of someone who has already decided that the next 6 hours are going to be productive. I looked at the valley below us, at the fractured remains of what had been a clean, confident encirclement, at the 2 non-functional war platforms sitting dark and silent where they had stopped, at the scattered formation of 300 soldiers who no longer knew exactly where we were, or how many of us there had been, or why the engagement had gone the way it had. 6 hours. A battalion incoming. I opened the terrain map and started planning what we were going to do with the canyon that lay 2 kilometers to the east, the one with the natural rock walls on both sides, and the loose stone shelf 40 meters up on the left face that had been sitting there for what looked like several thousand years, just waiting for someone with a reason to disturb it. We had a reason now. I started making notes. When the battalion arrived at dawn, I want to be precise about what dawn looked like on that world, because it matters to what happened next. Sunrise on that planet came sideways. The star was low on the horizon, and it came up slow, dragging a long red light across the terrain that turned everything the color of heated iron. The canyon walls caught that light and threw it back, so that the whole landscape glowed. It was the kind of dawn that, under different circumstances, a person might call beautiful. Under these circumstances, it was tactically useful. The reinforcement battalion moved in formation down the main approach corridor from the north. 1,200 Velkari soldiers, plus armored units, plus a command element that I identified from their signal profile as belonging to a different prince. A secondary member of the royal family sent to resolve what Prince Velorath had apparently described in his request as a persistent and unclassified tactical anomaly. That was us. We were a persistent and unclassified tactical anomaly. I had spent the 6-hour window doing 3 things. First, I had the squad rest in shifts. This sounds obvious, but it is not. In high-stress extended engagements, the temptation is to stay alert and active, which feels productive but depletes the one resource you cannot resupply in the field: human cognitive function. 2 hours of genuine rest per person, rotating, meant that when the battalion arrived, my squad was sharper than they had been at the start of the engagement. The Velkari battalion had been traveling through the night to reach us. They had not rested. Second, I sent Cole and Grant to prepare the canyon. I am not going to go into detail about the exact preparation in this tribunal report, because some of it involves classified field engineering techniques that are not appropriate for open record. What I will say is that the eastern canyon had a loose stone shelf on its left wall, as I noted earlier, and that 2 people with 6 hours and the right tools can accomplish considerably more than most people would expect. Third, I decoded the full transcript of Prince Velorath's communications from the overnight period. This is where things became genuinely interesting. The decoded transmissions painted a picture I had not fully anticipated. Velorath had not described our unit's size accurately to his command chain. He had reported contact with what he estimated to be an assault force of indeterminate size operating in coordinated multiple-axis engagement. He had reported the loss of 3 war platforms and significant disruption of communication infrastructure. He had not, in any of his transmissions, mentioned the word 12. I do not think he was deliberately concealing the information. I think he genuinely did not know. In the darkness and the dust and the fluid movement of the engagement, with signal scramblers degrading their communication, and 3 war platforms going dark in sequence, it is entirely possible that 300 Velkari soldiers never arrived at an accurate count of how many people they were dealing with. The Velkari command model is top-down and information-dependent. When the information flow is disrupted, the entire decision-making structure goes uncertain. What this meant practically was that the incoming battalion of 1,200 soldiers was arriving to reinforce against a threat they believed to be a large assault force, possibly battalion-sized, possibly supported by heavy equipment. They were moving carefully. They were moving with their flanks protected, and their command element shielded at the rear. They were not looking for 12 people in a canyon. I read one particular line in Velorath's transmissions to the squad during the final briefing before the battalion arrived. The translation was slightly rough because of compression artifacts in the signal, but the meaning was clear enough. He had written, in his official report to the Royal Command, "These creatures do not behave as soldiers. They behave as something for which I have no adequate classification." Danyar, who was sitting with her injured legs stretched out in front of her, and a field dressing wrapped around her thigh, listened to me read that line, and then was quiet for a moment. "What do they think we are?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, "but I think we are about to make it worse." The battalion entered the approach corridor at 5 minutes past dawn. I was watching from the high ground above the canyon's northern mouth, flat on the stone with a long-range scope. The formation was disciplined. The soldiers moved well. Their commander, whoever was leading from the ground, clearly knew what they were doing. Under other circumstances, against another opponent, that battalion would have been a serious and effective force. The approach corridor funneled naturally into the canyon's eastern mouth. This was geographical reality, not something we had created. The canyon was simply the path of least resistance through the terrain, and a formation of 1,200 moving at pace in the early morning would naturally flow toward the path of least resistance. They were inside the canyon walls within 8 minutes of entering the corridor. I gave the order at the 9-minute mark. Cole triggered the preparation from the far end of the canyon. What followed was loud, It was also quick. The stone shelf on the left wall had been holding for thousands of years through natural tension, and when that tension was released, at 3 specific points simultaneously, it released the way geological things do, completely, and without hesitation. The canyon filled with noise and dust and the kind of physical force that terrain can produce when you stop holding it back. I want to be very clear for the tribunal record. The preparation was designed to block, not to harm. The shelf came down across the canyon's width at the 3/4 point, filling the passage with rubble from wall to wall. The battalion was in the front 3/4. The command element was in the rear quarter. The 2 sections were now separated by a barrier of loose rock that would take hours to clear. A fighting force separated from its command element is not a fighting force. It is a large number of people with no coordinating instruction, waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. We did not let anyone tell them what to do next. I will not walk the tribunal through the full detail of the following 3 hours. There are tactical reports that cover the specifics. What I will say is this: 12 people, properly positioned, with the right equipment and the right terrain understanding, can make 1,200 people feel like they are surrounded. You do not need to be everywhere. You need to be unpredictable. You need to be loud in one place and silent in another. You need to make every decision the enemy makes feel like it might be the wrong one. When a force cannot coordinate and cannot predict the location of the threat and cannot determine the size of the threat, it stops advancing and starts waiting for clarity. Clarity never came. At the 7-hour mark, Prince Velarath's command ship moved. I watched it go on the long-range scope, lifting from its position at the rear of the original formation and beginning a fast retreat to the north. It was the most honest thing that happened in the entire engagement. No transmission, no further demands, no formal withdrawal order. Just a ship deciding that remaining in its current location was not acceptable and moving away from whatever was in that canyon. His final transmission, sent to his royal command chain and intercepted by our equipment, was decoded in fragments. The translator struggled with some of it, but the core of it came through clearly enough. "What are these things?" he wrote. That was the complete message. 6 words in Velkari that translated to 6 words in English. No tactical assessment, no after-action breakdown, no recommendation. Just a question that had no answer he could provide, because he did not have the information to answer it. What we were was 12 scouts with standard equipment, 6 years of training, and 72 hours before extraction. What we were was exactly what the Velkari had been told we were when we identified ourselves. They simply had not believed it. I want to stop being precise for a moment. I have given the tribunal the sequence of events. I have given the tactical assessments and the engagement timelines, and the transmission intercepts. I have accounted for every decision and explained the reasoning behind each one. That is my job, and I have done it. But a tribunal report is not the only kind of truth, and I think the people in this room deserve both kinds. So let me tell you about Osei Grant. He was 23 years old. He came from a small town in the north of the country, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and the big news of the week is, who won the regional football match? He had joined the Scouts because, as he told me during our first conversation, after he was assigned to my unit, he wanted to see something bigger than what he had already seen. He said it without any particular drama or ambition. He just wanted to see more of the world. More of the worlds, as it turned out. He had a habit of tilting his head slightly to one side when he was thinking. He spoke quietly almost all the time. He had the scar above his left eyebrow from when a training drone had malfunctioned and clipped him on the cheek, and he always brushed it off when anyone asked. Said it looked worse than it was, said he barely remembered it. During the second phase of the engagement, after the canyon preparation and the battalion separation, I assigned Osei to hold a pass on the western side of the ridge. It was a narrow point, a natural choke that I needed covered to prevent any Velkari units from flanking around the canyon barrier and getting behind our positions. It was not supposed to be a long assignment, 40 minutes, maybe 50, and then I would rotate someone else in. It took longer than I planned. The canyon situation required more management than the timeline projected, and I missed the rotation window by 18 minutes. In those 18 minutes, Ose held that pass alone. He held it against a Velkari response unit that had found the flank route I had been worried about, a group of about 40 soldiers who had figured out that the canyon was not the only approach and had come around the long way. 40-1. He held the pass for 40 minutes by himself, using every piece of terrain knowledge and every technique in the scout training manual and some things, I am told by the soldiers who reached him afterward, that were not in the manual at all. When we reached him, he was sitting against the rock wall of the pass with his weapon across his knees and his eyes open. He had done what he set out to do. The pass was held, our flank was clean. He was 23 years old. I am not going to dress that up. I am not going to frame it in the language of duty or sacrifice or strategic necessity, because those words, as true as they are, sometimes become a way of making something smaller than it actually is. Say Grant was a quiet young man who wanted to see more of the world, and he saw quite a lot of it, and then he was not there anymore. And that is a true and complete account of what happened, that is also entirely separate from the tactical record. Corporal Nina Yena, when she found out, sat down on the ground and did not speak for 4 minutes. Then she stood up and continued her assignment. That is also true and complete and separate from the tactical record. Daniar heard the news and said nothing at all. She had been walking on her injured leg for 19 hours at that point. She kept walking. Private Lena Ford said, very quietly, that she wanted to go home. Then she said, equally quietly, that she knew they could not yet, and picked up her equipment. I am listing these things for the tribunal, because I want the record to show that the 12 people in this story were not 12 units. They were 12 human beings with specific faces, and specific habits, and specific things they were going to do when they got home. And 10 of us came back, and 2 of us did not. And both of those numbers matter. Lance Corporal Petra Holt did not make the extraction either. She was hit in the final hour, during the last push before the Velkari began their withdrawal. It was fast. She would not have known much about it. I know that is meant to be a comfort, and I am not entirely sure it works as one, but I offer it to the record anyway. 10 out of 12. Those are the numbers. We reached the extraction point at the 79-hour mark. 3 hours past the window. The transport crew had waited, which they were not required to do past 72 hours, and which I will never stop being grateful for. The crew chief, a warrant officer whose name is in the supplemental record, looked at the 10 of us coming in from the landing zone, and then looked at the space where 12 should have been, and did not say anything, which was exactly the right choice. We boarded. We lifted. The planet fell away below us. I sat with my back against the transport hull, and looked at the 10 people in my unit, all of them moving in that particular way that exhausted soldiers move, which is not so much movement as controlled falling, letting the body do the minimum necessary to stay functional until somewhere safe appears. Daniar had finally allowed the transport medic to properly treat her leg. Cole was asleep before we cleared the atmosphere. Yenna was staring at nothing with an expression that I recognized and did not disturb. I looked out the viewport at the planet below. Somewhere down there, Prince Velarath was explaining himself to his command chain. Somewhere down there, 2 royal princes were reading engagement reports that described events they would spend considerable time trying to understand. Somewhere down there, 1,200 soldiers were digging through a canyon barrier and trying to figure out what had happened to them. Somewhere down there, the Velkari Empire was starting to ask a question that they would not fully resolve for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I want that in the record too. I felt tired, and I felt the weight of the 2 missing people. Very specifically, in a way that had nothing to do with the mission outcome. And I looked at the planet below, and thought about Osei Grant wanting to see something bigger than what he had already seen. He had seen it. That much was certain. I just wish he had been able to tell me what it looked like. Let me tell you what happened after we came home. Because the story does not end at the extraction point. It ends much further out than that. And some of what came after is, in its own way, more astonishing than anything that happened on that ridge. 3 weeks after we returned, I was called into a secure briefing at command headquarters. Not unusual after an engagement of that complexity. I expected a full debrief, tactical review, and analysis of what had worked and what had not. I dressed in my formal uniform for the first time in months, and sat down across from a table of officers whose combined experience represented several centuries of military service. The senior officer at the table, a general whose name I will not include here because she has not given permission for it, opened the briefing with a statement I was not prepared for. The Velkari Primacy, she said, has filed a formal diplomatic inquiry with the United Earth Space Forces, requesting clarification on the composition and classification of the unit engaged in the Velkari Supply Corridor incident. She paused to let that settle. They want to know, she continued, what experimental weapons system was deployed in that engagement. I sat with that for a moment. We weren't an experimental weapons system, I said. No, the general agreed. You were not. We were a standard scout unit. Yes. 12 people. Standard equipment. Standard training. Correct. She looked at me across the table, with the expression of someone who has spent a long time in a room where important things are decided, and has learned to read the shape of moments before they fully arrive. The Velkari, she said, cannot reconcile what their forces experienced with the data we have provided them regarding standard scout unit composition and capability. They have reviewed the report 3 times. They believe there is information being withheld. There isn't, I said. I know that, she said. The problem is that they do not. I thought about the canyon. I thought about the fractured encirclement and the signal scramblers, and Daniar shooting through the dust cloud, and Cole moving silently through the rear of the formation with a tool in his hand. I thought about the way 12 people had, over the course of 79 hours, made a force of roughly 1,500 soldiers feel like they were dealing with something they did not have a name for. And then, the general told me the part I had not known. 3 Velkari princes had convened an emergency session of the High Council. This was, she told me, the first time in 200 years that the High Council had been convened over a non-fleet engagement. The standing item on the agenda, recorded in their imperial archive, was 2 words in Velkari, that translated to English as, the human problem. Underneath the agenda item, in the formal notations required by Velkari protocol, there was a subnote, a single sentence explaining the reason the emergency session had been called. We only battled a human scout unit. That was the sentence. 10 words. That was the reason. 3 princes of the Velkari Empire had gathered their council, called the oldest emergency procedure in their governmental history, and begun an urgent discussion about what to do about humanity. Not a human fleet, not a human planetary assault, not an experimental weapons program or a covert military operation, or any of the things that would reasonably prompt an empire to call an emergency council. A scout unit. 12 people. The general let me read the translated intelligence report in full. I read it slowly. I read it twice. The Velkari Council had apparently discussed, at length, what made the engagement in the supply corridor different from their prior encounters with human forces. They had considered the weapons, the tactics, the terrain use, the communication disruption. They had looked at all of it from every angle. And then one of the princes, the eldest of the 3, had said something that the intelligence report included almost as a footnote, because the analyst who translated it was not entirely sure of its significance. But I understood it immediately. The prince had said, "What disturbs me is not that they were effective. What disturbs me is that they were ordinary. Ordinary. A standard unit, standard equipment, standard training. Nothing special, nothing experimental, nothing classified. Just what we produce, just what we train, just what we send out to do reconnaissance work in enemy space and expect to come home in 72 hours. The Velkari Empire spent the next several weeks, as I later learned through continued intelligence reports, attempting to acquire information about the human scout training program. They went through diplomatic channels, through third-party intermediaries, through sources I am not going to name in an open record. They were trying to find the secret, the special process, the enhancement program, the thing that explained what they had encountered. There was no secret. There was a training curriculum that every scout candidate in the USF goes through. There are physical standards, cognitive assessments, field exercise requirements. There is a final certification process that takes about 11 months in total. At the end of it, you have someone like Cole or Yenna or Daniar or Osei Grant. When the Velkari finally accepted that there was no hidden program, that the scout training curriculum was what it appeared to be, that the people they had encountered in that supply corridor were the product of a standard military educational system and nothing more, the peace negotiations began within 30 days. I was not in the room for those negotiations. I am not a diplomat, but I was given a summary of the opening session, and there is one exchange from that session that I want to include in this record because it feels relevant. The Velkari lead negotiator, a senior minister of their Foreign Affairs Council, had opened the session by requesting, as a condition of good faith dialogue, that the USF provide a full inventory of its Special Forces programs. The USF representative had confirmed that the information would be provided. Then the minister had said, carefully, that he specifically wanted to understand more about what he described as the program that produced the unit from the supply corridor incident. The U.S. representative had confirmed that information about that program would be included. The Velkari minister had nodded formally and then, after a pause that the session transcript noted as lasting approximately 12 seconds, asked one further question. What is the name of the program? The U.S. representative had looked at her notes and then looked up and said, in the tone of someone providing information that is entirely routine and requires no elaboration, basic scout training. The session transcript notes that the Velkari minister was then quiet for approximately 31 seconds before responding. 31 seconds is a long time in a formal diplomatic session. The transcript does not record what he said during those 31 seconds, because he did not say anything during those 31 seconds. He simply sat there with the information. Then he thanked the representative for her time and suggested a brief recess. The ceasefire was signed 4 days later. I stood at the memorial service for Osei Grant and Petra Holt 2 weeks after that. It was a quiet service. Their families were there. Some of the other squad members. A few officers from command. The sky above the memorial ground was an ordinary blue, the kind of blue that does not require any particular description, and the air was cool and still. I thought about what the Velkari minister had felt sitting with that 31 seconds of silence. I thought about him absorbing the information that the name of the program was Basic Scout Training, and that the unit he was asking about was the product of a system that produces, reliably, in large numbers, the kind of people who go into an encirclement of 300 soldiers in the dark and start thinking about the terrain. I thought about what it would be like to understand that there are not 12 of them. There are thousands. And then I thought about Osei Grant, sitting against the rock wall of the pass with his weapon across his knees, having already decided what he was going to do with the next 40 minutes, and the kind of math that he was entirely comfortable with. He wanted to see something bigger than what he had already seen. I think he got what he wanted. I think he understood, in the way that the best soldiers understand things, that the size of what you are part of is not always visible from where you are standing. You see 12 people in a canyon. You see the pass in front of you and the 40 coming toward you, and the math that other people might call impossible. You do not see the Velkari High Council convening an emergency session. You do not see the diplomatic negotiations and the ceasefire agreements, and the ripple that moves through an empire when it realizes, quietly, what it is dealing with. You see the pass, you hold it, and somewhere much further out, the world changes shape because you did. I stood at that memorial, and I said what I had to say, and then I stood quietly for a while and let it be what it was. Then I walked back to the base and put in the paperwork for the unit's next deployment. We had a job to do. We have always had a job to do. The tribunal asked me, at the end of my testimony, what I thought the most important lesson of the engagement was. What I thought command should take from the record of those 79 hours. What the principle was, if there was one, that ran through all of it. I thought for a moment. Not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it correctly, in the fewest possible words, the way scouts are trained to communicate. A scout unit, I said, is not a small thing that does small work. It is the leading edge of something that the Velkari, for all their empires and councils and princes, could not fully calculate. They looked at 12 people and saw a size they could manage. They did not see what 12 people represent. They did not see what 12 people can become when you train them correctly and send them somewhere that matters and trust them to make good decisions in the dark. I paused. They know now, I said. The general at the head of the table wrote something in the margin of the report in front of her. She did not share what it was. The other officers were quiet. I thought about Nina Yena's sneeze that had started the whole thing. Somewhere in that thought was something that might have been humor, of the specific kind that only exists on the far side of very hard situations. You asked what happened out there, I said. 12 humans happened. And the galaxy is still deciding what to do about that. The tribunal was silent for a long moment. Then the general nodded once and said, "Dismissed, Sergeant." I stood, straightened my uniform, and walked out of the room into the ordinary daylight of a Tuesday afternoon, which looked exactly like every other Tuesday afternoon I had ever seen, which was somehow exactly right. End.